All right, shalom, shalom. I had to restart because something happened to the other live. I'm not sure what happened, but I want to quickly. I'm gonna just do this real fast and kind of establish this. I guess since that other one messed up, but let me point something out real fast. We end up finding out who is the Exodus Pharaoh. What's the haplogroup of the Exodus Pharaoh? So, what, obviously, I'm just gonna quickly give a quick understanding of obviously the genetics of the area, what the Bible usually gives you understanding of, which is the Levant is basically very diverse. It's a very diverse area, especially about the time of Abraham. It's going to be a very diverse area at that time. Um, so very important. We know that A groups are going to be in the Levant, right? Here's a study we had went over the Paleolithic Y haplogroup heritage, right? Dominance in Cretan highland areas, pretty much. And we know that a lot of the A groups actually were settled in areas of Crete and had settled in areas, obviously, of Africa and areas of the Levant. So you can see some settlement areas of Levant. And we talk about how those are going to be the Hamitic lineages. Now, what's also important is that we also had expressed some very interesting things with different haplogroups, but I want to point something out. So I'm just going to kind of skip ahead, get a little through on this just to make something important. I'm just going to give a quick summary. Now, I probably shouldn't make the summary because last time I made the summary, I felt like I should have just went by and went through it. So later live, starting a little later. So I'm gonna point something out. This is what I'm gonna point out. That one, we found the family of the Exodus, Ramses the first, Seti the first, and Ramses the second, which is one exclusive family, right? Very important. Let me open up something real fast and point this out. So very important to point this out. Let me make sure I think about it. I think about how it's worded, but I'm sure it shouldn't be hard right here.
Today I'm going to
Why is this important? Because the transition of a certain pharaoh's line, which is kind of important, actually very important.
think that that person
I'm just gonna skip a little ahead right here and point this out here, and then continue from this point.
but we all know his name because in the 1920s, his tomb was discovered almost entirely intact, something that is very rare in Egypt because most tombs ended up being robbed over the centuries. The mask that you see pictured here was one of the most important things that was found in his tomb, younger lady area. What exactly caused his death is not known. Also comes to an end. And this is where Dynasty 18 comes to an end. Ramses I, the founder of the 19th dynasty, had originally served as Horemheb's vizier, which is kind of like a prime minister. But when Horemheb died, he became pharaoh. He was followed by his son, Seti I. Because of the instability that followed Akhenaten's reign, Egypt's territory had shrunk by this point. But Seti was able to turn things around. Then things really took off under the reign of his son, Ramses the Great, who is generally...
All right. So now let me point out those are the three family lines. This is the family line we need to know right here. Why? Because it's very important. I'm sure. Right here, Ramses the first, Seti the first, and Ramses the second, or Ramses the Great. So this is going to be a very important family line because they're going to settle in certain areas. Now, kind of got to go over what I went over before, but I'm just going to point out some major finds, right? Why is this important? Let me just show you something. So in the area of Canaan and the Canaanite area, there was an invasion, right? There was a takeover. Before I even start, we're gonna go back to this, but I'm just gonna quickly point this out as I was talking about this earlier. Now, remember, linguistics, right? The nations the whole world after Babel was divided by linguistics. Linguistics does not care about your genetics. Linguistics only care about your basically similarity in conversation, right? For example, here's something from National Geographic. It's very important when studying the ancient Levant. We know it went through many phases. I just mentioned this earlier, but I want to make sure I mention it again. Most likely, the time when Abraham was entered the picture, it was during the Levant. Was in his third dynasty, right? So that's multiple transitions that it go through. But if you know about the third dynasty of right, it looked about like this, right? This is where Abraham came from. So about from this area, just to get a little insight on some of the things. Obviously, the Akkadians were there, right? It happened obviously when they was there. Obviously, connections with the Elamites and whatnot. A lot of other nations all tied with this little area. So by the time of Abraham, the place looked really shooken up. But this is where you get the mention of Abraham, right? Abraham, common patriarch, obviously. You can see right here, they'll say born in around this time, right? Although estimated dates range between, 2300 BC to basically like 1960 BC. Some say 18 BC. Some identification of with of Chaldeans in the Hebrew Bible is not entirely certain. But we do have, there's a lot of people that went over this and they do know that this is about the dynasty of that, because there's other ways of knowing. Obviously, they're having connections to Semitic um, things, and a lot of different things circle around it. Maybe we'll go over it another time and talk about some of the things that happens around this area of the Upper Mesopotamia, right? So that dynasty is actually important. But there's a lot of important things that go around with other dynasties as other um, invasions go on with Mesopotamia. For writings from National Geographic is basically about certain pharaohs that had certain letters. Why is it important? Because the way that they spoke, right, how they spoke was important, right? It wasn't like they all was having to translate different languages. They was actually having very similar languages to each other. For example, here's something that says the letters are not written, right? You think with the Armana letters and certain things like that, right? The letters are not written in ancient Egyptian, but in Akkadian, a language spoken widely in ancient Mesopotamia. Because when you think Akkadian, don't just think, right. A lot of times we think of empires taking other empires, always a genocide, right? Don't think just because, like for example, if we get one nation, right, one nation ruling over this area, right, from Assyria to Babylon, right? Does Babylon go on a campaign of wiping out all the seed of the Assyrians? Does every nation that conquers a nation, do they do a genocide? Not every nation does that, right? If a new power takes over, sometimes, yes, their seed usually is in certain areas. So that's why we want to look for pinpoints in certain areas. But that doesn't mean that other cultures can live in that different area, right? Because other people can live there and dwell there. So sometimes that happens. Now, you can see right here, the letters are not written in ancient Egyptian, but in Akkadian, a language spoken widely in ancient Mesopotamia. Note what it says here. In the second millennium BC, so about 2000 to about like 1000 BC, you'll get a change of basically what they call lingua franca, right? Basically, you can get a little understanding of it. Let me just copy it and basically point out what it is. It's basically like how English is, right? A lot of people are not English men, but they speak English, right? They maybe have multiple languages. A language that is adopted as a common language between speakers whose native languages are different. So, very important. So, sometimes you see things like that where people will have the same language across the whole region, right? Similar to the role of how English plays in international regions, right? You got a lot of nations that speak English, a lot of different nations, right? I don't know a country so far that doesn't speak it, right? But what's interesting is the Mitanni, right? Why is this important? Because I'm gonna point something out with the genetics that the Mitanni had some connections going down into Egypt. Now, this is what's important. The Mitanni, as it says right here, the king of Mitanni. I'm just going to skip down to some of the highlights that's on letter 27. Basically, what it talks about. It talks about how the king of Mitanni, right, basically makes himself equal with the pharaoh and calls himself brother, pretty much. You can see right here when he's talking to Akhenaten, right, the king of Egypt, he says, "My brother, my son-in-law," right? Certain things like that, whom I love, and things like that. That's important. So we should find some interesting connections when we're thinking about is Egypt getting ties with the upper nations, other nations, and yeah, they start to get some very interesting ties with each other. For example, what I'm going to show real fast is I'm going to show how the line of the Exodus Pharaoh that many scholars agree that is about that time, about Exodus, about Ramses II. That Exodus Pharaoh's family line is not the line of the Israelites. We obviously know that. We obviously know that that line is not the line of Israelites, because there's a scripture where he says he's going to separate. He's going to make a separation between their seed and his seed, right? But also, what's important is what haplogroup we find. One thing that's important is the pharaohs before this line were R groups, but the pharaohs after this line were E groups. But the line that's in the middle is actually going to be different than R and E. It's going to be something that is going to be its own line in the midst of these ones. Why? Because it's going to be a different dynasty. It's going to be a different line, and we can find them. We can actually find them. So this is what gets fairly interesting. So just to point out a little find here, I want to show. First, I want to point something out here. In the land of the Levant, they had these very interesting burial that was going on there. I'm just going to try to fly through with
Of a
it.
much earlier era. In the process, shedding new light on ancient life and religion in the region during the Late Bronze Age, just prior to the destruction of the site. Much like other cities all over the Mediterranean and beyond during this tumultuous time. It was only due to severe erosion that had taken away 5 layers of the city that the discovery was made. And within a few days, small models of the Canaanite gods Baal and Resheph were found in the earth, smiting their enemies with hands held high. Temples like this had been discovered before in other Canaanite sites like Megiddo, Nablus, and Hazor. But often looters get to the sites before the archaeologists. For years, this site would be excavated. And now, finally, the findings have been released. Today, all that remains here is a vast mound of barren earth. Yet, long ago, during the Middle and Late Bronze Age, the city of Lachish was one of the most important of all Canaanite strongholds. Destroyed and rebuilt many times over the centuries, with occupation beginning as early as the pre-pottery Neolithic of the 6th millennium BC. The site remains a prime example of both the opportunities and difficulties that have long accompanied life in the Levant, situated on the periphery between empires and powerful kingdoms. Major developments at the site began during the early Bronze Age, and by around 2000 BC, a unique culture we can identify as Canaanite came to rule the entire region. The remains of a cult centre, along with religious offerings, have been found from this era, as well as a palace and vast sloping wall surrounding the citadel. A testament to the warlike times these people lived through. The temple rebuilt once more by Canaanite deities.
All right, so let's dive in. So right back to what we was talking about. If you know about Seti's tomb, right? When they found Seti, let me just point this out, right? When they found Seti's tomb, right? If you've seen his extravagant, decorated tomb, right? Whatnot. This was a highlight from it. Seti I had been buried in one of Egypt's most colorful royal tombs. But here's the highlight. But his body was gone by the time its richly decorated halls were discovered. So remember that the body of Seti I was missing from his tomb. He was somewhere else, right? This was very important. First, I'm gonna show you something. All right, I already went through this already, but I'm gonna just quickly point out something, something that's fairly interesting. Right, we got a lot of interesting things that happen in the area of the Levant, and I'm gonna point out something that we found in certain areas. Now, a lot of these places you gotta know the story behind because the Levant, especially at certain frames, are very very complex, and you gotta know what's going on with these areas and who's in these areas and who's gonna be who, right? So it's gonna be very important. But there's one find that's very important in particular. This one that's 1934, and this is gonna be very important what we find there. So note that mtDNA I5, and then this yDNA J-M267. So this is gonna be very important. This very specific one right here. It's going to be very important because we're going to come back to this and we're going to talk about this. So note that I5 there. Very important. All right, so let's understand something. So that was something that was found in Tel Shadud, right? The shared mortuary, right? Because it was found inside a certain container, which is going to look just like this, right? Just like one of these little things right here. So the shared mortuary aspects of Tel Shadud and the latter sites indicate a strong link with New Egypt, New Kingdom Egypt. So that's going to be very important. So we're going to see a tie between this area. Now, what's important? I got to make sure I point this out again, right? What is a tell, right? What is it? What is a tell? What's going on with that? What is a tell, right? Let me just point it out, right? Just like the scripture says, Hosea 2:22, the earth shall hear the corn and the oil and the wine and the oil, and they shall hear Jezreel, right? A tell, right? Jezreel is actually a tell. So they're gonna actually hear the story of what's going on at this area. I'm just gonna skip a little ahead where they just explain what is a tell.
And what is tell? What is tell? Tell. Tell. Yeah. Do you want to talk about a tell?
Yeah, why not?
All right, then tell.
Okay, Tel, which is written in Hebrew differently than my name, Tal. Tel is in some kind of an artificial archaeological mound or a small hill that is man-made. Usually it's going to be like heaven for archaeologists.
Yes.
Because the minute they start digging in it, you will find it like a most delicious layered chocolate cake. One layer on top of the other.
Oh, she's talking about cakes.
Ancient layers are going to be at the bottom, and then one city on top of the other,
Yeah.
one fortress on top of the other.
That's true. It's like layers of cities. Yes. City on top of a city on top of a city. It's artificial. What we need is to excavate. And what we need is people that want to excavate and lots of money and time.
So can I say something about...
Yes, please.
So very important. What we're looking at was a thing that was found, right? A very secret thing that was found in a tell, right? Is actually basically a city that was ruled by certain powers, right? As we're going to look at. And we're going to look at the certain genetics, what was connected there and whatnot. Now, we're going to transition to the 19th dynasty. Now, we're going to look at the last group of the 18th dynasty. And you can see right here, we can see a transition. If we recall, let me make sure I open up a note here. I have two notes I want to make sure is open here. This one too, and one more. Just let it load up real fast. Now, if we recall, what's fairly interesting about this is if we start to match history to this exact time frame, we're going to find something fairly interesting, and that's what we're going to talk about real fast. You just make sure this one pops up here, and we're going to dive in. Just let that load up. All right. That should be fine right there. All right. Let's get back to it. So let's go into what's going on here. So I'm basically going to illustrate why I'm showing you this. So let me just make a quick understanding of the Levanten area. Also, let me pull up a map. The area of the control that we need to know about is that Egypt, right? When you think about this time frame with Egypt, it's stretched upwards. Let me just point something out here. Right here. So to give a little idea of the map. This one, matter of fact, let's get Ramses. All right. I'm going to look for a decent map. Let's actually put Ramses the first. Okay, this one's fine right here. All right. So this is important because the area of Egypt that ruled this area, they also reached all the way up here to the area of the Hittites. So that's going to be very important as we go over the information that this area right here is going to be ruled. As you can see, these areas are going to be ruled by Egyptians, and they're going to be setting their peoples there, and some rulers are going to be sitting there as well. So I'm going to make this statement real fast, as I made before. The reason why I don't believe haplogroup J is ancient Israelites is by the fact it is the line of the exact Exodus Pharaoh's ydna. Pharaoh Seti the first, father of Ramses the second. So very important. But let me show you a little bit of the Levant.
In the last episode on the history of ancient Canaan, we left off with the founding of Egypt's 18th dynasty by Pharaoh Ahmose I. In Canaan and the western Levant fell to the Egyptians. This though brought them into conflict with the other great powerhouse of the region, the Hurrian kingdom of the Mitanni. The Mitanni had claimed much of the same land to have been within their own sphere of influence. In return for their allegiance, the Canaanite cities were given Egyptian protection against all outside threats. While there was a loss of political independence, most of these cities actually benefited economically from Egyptian control, since both sides wanted to keep the lucrative trade between the two lands flowing without a hitch. Large quantities of Egyptian luxury items, such as ivory and glazed vessels, entered Canaan, while Canaanite wine, bronze tools, and textiles made their way into Egypt. Of course, due to their unchallenged rule of the area, the Egyptians were able to set the terms for any mercantile exchange, which obviously was set in their favor. Today the site of Tel el-Amarna. Most of these were written in the Babylonian dialect of Akkadian, the international language of commerce and diplomacy at the time. Though several of these documents consist of letters from other great kings of the period, the vast majority of them are diplomatic correspondence between the pharaoh and his vassal princes in Canaan and the Levant. In them, alias vassals and client kings, these pharaohs also sought to limit Hittite expansion into Syria.
All right, so that's just some understanding for the maps. Just to get a quick understanding again, these areas were owned by the Empire of Egypt. But let's look a little more closer to get pinpoint on which rulers were there. So here's an interesting one. According to archaeologists, right, I'm going to show you a burial of someone where they say an ordinary person could not afford the purchase of such a coffin. It is obvious the deceased was a member of the local elite. So I'm going to show you something that's kind of interesting here. A little something here of a find. So note these years. So we're going to find something about this time frame of these years. 3,300-year-old coffin was exposed containing the personal belongings of a wealthy Canaanite, right? Possibly an official of the Egyptian army, right? So we're actually going to find out how high up is actually this individual that's found in this area of Tel Shadud. So remember, these tells were actually cities. So it was destroyed, and they found it underneath this tell. So very, very important stuff. So this is actually the coffin. This is what it would look like. So it was buried, cracked a little bit, and everything. But let's keep on going in. So you can see a little bit of the burial site, right? Just going to talk about a little information of it. I'm going to point out some highlights that they talk about on the burial site. So let me close this real fast. I'm just going to point out some of the highlights. All right. Matter of fact, we want to keep it open. We want to keep it open so that I read it right on here. I'll read it right on this. All right. So let's go down and read what they found. So down here on what they found something kind of interesting that I think is important. See this gold scarab right here? It's going to be very important for what they found there. So I'm going to just read a little bit of what's going on here. That was in the area controlled by the Egyptians in the Jezreel Valley, right, in the late Bronze Age, right, 13th century BC and everything. During the period when the pharaohs governed the country, right, Egyptian culture greatly influenced the local Canaanite upper class, right, very important. Signs of Egyptian influence are occasionally discovered in different regions, and this time they were revealed at Tel Shadud, right? In where? In the special tomb of the wealthy Canaanite. So very important. They found this connection in this area. A rare artifact that was found next to the skeleton is an Egyptian scarab seal. Now, this is important because a seal is used to seal documents. This means that this person with this seal is saying that this is in my name, right? This is in the name of the ruler of this area, right? Encased in gold, right? Infixed to a ring. So this person is walking around with this seal on them and is encased in gold. The scarab was used to seal documents and objects, right? The name of the crown of Pharaoh Seti I, who ruled ancient Egypt in 13th century BC, appears on the seal. Why is this important? Because we need to start finding pinpoints of this family line. If we cannot find Ramses the first, and we cannot find Ramses the second, if we can find the son of Ramses the first and the father of Ramses the second, then we can find out what's going on with this line here. We can get a good understanding of what's going on there. So right here, the scarab was used to seal documents. Obviously, when we get down, so obviously ruled that at that time, Seti the first was the father of Ramses the second, identified by some scholars as the pharaoh mentioned in the biblical story of the Israelite exodus from Egypt, right? Remember how he says it's going to make a difference, right? Already in the first year of his reign, right, 1294 BC, a revolt broke out. This was important, that revolt. Where is that revolt? What happens at that revolt? You can see right here. Where is it at? Let's copy that and just show it here. There's a revolt in his time frame. Where is that revolt? That revolt is not in Egypt, but is in Canaan, right here, right about here. So this is going to give us an understanding on what's going on there. So this area, that was an Egyptian family that's going to be coming here to solve a revolt, right? A very important event that's happening there, right? All right, so you can see right here in that valley, Seti conquered that region and established Egyptian rule in Canaan. So what did he do? Seti conquered that region and established Egyptian rule in Canaan. Seti's name on the seal symbolized power and protection and all types of things with his, their idols and whatnot. So it's saying that's an official seal, pretty much. It's clearly visible on the seal. So it's letting you know the protector of Pharaoh's name or the sovereign himself is clearly visible on the seal, right? They're obviously looking at what's going on there. To the Pharaoh said on the scarab found in the coffin, aided Now look what it did. It also helped archaeologists in dating that type of burial design. That was the Egyptian burial design. The way that they was buried in there was in a couple different places, right? Which were Egyptian administrative centers. So those different designs help with other burial designs and everything. So just talk about what not, talk about the burial and everything, right? When we talk about at Tel Shadud, right? Obviously, it was surprising, right? Evidence of an Egyptian presence was detected in archaeological surveys conducted in the Jezreel Valley in the past, but the discovery of the impressive one, right, in Tel Shadud surprised obviously archaeologists, right? Tel Shadud preserves the biblical name Sharad. How you say that? Or Sharad. How you say that, right? And the mound is often referred to as Tel Sharad, right? What's going on there, right? Get some very important ties. Remember, Joshua attacked that place, right? They all came there. They talk about the third lot came up for the tribe of Zebulun, according to the families, and the territory of this area was this area, right? Later on, another nation ended up taking that area, right? But at first, that area was ruled by Egypt. So that's what's important to make sure we look at this pinpoint to see what's going on there, the transition time frame, right? So it's going to give us a little understanding of these burials and everything. Obviously, they looked at the DNA, right? The Israeli Antiquities Authorities is currently looking into the possibilities of sampling the DNA from inside the coffin to see if the deceased was originally a Canaanite or an Egyptian person who was buried in Canaan. See what's going on there? We're going to look at what they found there, because what they found is kind of controversial. So in the 18th dynasty, we're going to see a transition, right? We already talked about that G group, right? And make sure this loads up. I talked about this before, right? Early Egyptians, you can see the early Egyptians, right? You can see obviously a lot of them, right? Imhotep and Tutankhamun and whatnot. So you can see all of them, and then you see their empty DNAs there. The female lineage will be K, right? But the Y DNA at that time was R lineage, right? We can see that with other papers, just to get like pinpoint on that's really what they found, right? In this certain dynasty, that was the family line at that time, right? Some G's, right? Some Y DNA, right? But they linked with certain, and then certain men from other lines, right? Because a G male can make an R male, right? A male with a G haplogroup can make an R, but they can mate by the females. So they did mate by there's certain ties with Egyptian men with the females. So that's going to be very important. Also to note where the females came from, right? That's going to give a very important tie with these things. But notice we did get a lot of R1Bs there with some Gs. But what's interesting is we see that G end up being at the end of the 18th dynasty, right? And then all of a sudden you see a J pop up, right? Now what's important is just to keep on diving. So if you've never seen the Battle of Kadesh, it's a very important battle. I'll just show a quick highlight here.
Mu'tali II assembled an even greater army with about 20 to 40,000.
So I'm not gonna show all of it, but if you've never seen, it just talks about basically how the Hittites and
they're running.
As you can see, the Egyptians go all the way up here, and you see the Hittites, they rule all the way over here. Then you see this Assyria. What's important to know about Assyria? Assyria also goes through phases, right? You got your Assyria, your ancient Proto-Assyria, and you got your Neo-Assyria, New Assyria, and other time frames, right? Very important. Yep. And that's into, I think what this brother said is actually extremely important. What he said here, right? Let me make sure we state that, right? Ramses III and Ramses II had two different father lineages. That's very important. Ramses III and Ramses II had two different father lineages. In fact, we can note the transition of this family all the way to Ramses III, which apparently there was a conspiracy called, I think it was called the Harlem conspiracy, where they apparently killed Ramses II and his son the same year when they died. So that's something that's important. But let me show you something.
But Seti was of his son, Ramses the Great, who is generally considered to be the greatest pharaoh of all time. He pushed his empire north to the borders of the Hittite Empire, as well as to the south into Nubia, achieving many great victories. He also built a new capital city and erected many colossal monuments and statues all over Egypt. The famous poem Ozymandias by confused with Nefertiti, but was actually a total rivals. And then we get a descendant of Ramses before it finally goes to a pharaoh named Setnakte. Setnakte was likely a descendant of Ramses the Great via some unknown junior branch of the family, and with him the 20th dynasty is said to have begun. He was followed by his son Ramses III, who was the greatest pharaoh of that dynasty and the last great pharaoh of the Egyptian New Kingdom, after his assassination in what has become.
All right, so obviously understand that and understanding, right? There's going to be some mtDNA connections, but note the importance here that Ramses II, right, wasn't what wasn't mentioned, is that Ramses II has ties with Ramses III, as Ramses II is making Ramses III his basically it's like a servant, pretty much. Like he's serving him is the best way to put it. You can see it if you want to ever see the little breakdown. We talked about it before when we talked about the difference between Ramses II and Ramses III. That's a major difference, right? These will be his sons. This will be just in connection in different ways. So doesn't make it quick. Just to explain it quick. Maybe this would be a quick highlight right here.
To turn things around. Then things really took off under the reign of his son.
I'm gonna see where's that exact time stamp. I want to.
The first was
point out
actually a totally different person. He also threw a wife named Setnakte.
Gotta think about where is it at?
Again, split
somewhere here. I'll explain. We'll go over it. I'll go over it another time. It's important to know that these are different, right? A lot of people know already that these are different. I don't want to get too off track, but let's understand again. Establishing the Levant. This is obviously before Ramses II. The Ramses III. This is Ramses the first to Seti the first to Ramses II. So even understanding that Ramses III doesn't come right after Ramses II. So it's like a gap of time in between those anyways. So that's something also to know. But this area is going to be important to get an understanding of that. This area is going to be controlled by that early 19th dynasty that comes and settle in these areas. So this is just a little bit talking of that on how they basically what they did and settle on these certain areas.
In line for the throne.
But let me skip down, get a little into the highlights here. Let's talk about some of these things and whatnot. So again, the reason why I'm showing you this is because it's going to give understanding to basically what happened and what's going on, why some of these things seem complex. Let me just go to a timestamp here.
Ramses went on to build a new capital in the far north of the empire and called it Pi-Ramses, which means...
If you know, he's the one that instructed Israel to build that area called Ramses and whatnot. I'm just going to open up something right here and kind of point something out.
But the empire he stands to inherit is emerging from a time of great political and religious upheaval, and Ramses is part of a dynasty that has forced its way to power. He watched as his grandfather, the first Ramses, became the first of the family to wear the Egyptian crown. Now he watches his father, King Seti, enforce his will through military power.
You have to remember that the Ramessides were a new family. Ramses I had only reigned for a year and a half. And then Seti comes to the throne and rules for about 11 years.
Ramses' family has to show that they are fit to rule. They choose to do it by building. building is the tool.
All right, so obviously they was increasing, they was growing, right? They was building areas, right? They were becoming very powerful. Also, that's why I was showing you of this battle. Why is this battle important? The Battle of Kadesh. Why is that important? Because the reason, right here, Kadesh, the reason why that's important is because the whole Levant changed. It became like how you see today, like how a lot of nations are kind of like sitting still. Some nations are going at it. You're gonna always have some scrambles going at it, but it was not like no major. All the nations fighting at once. A lot of nations had peace at that time. They was able to build and establish themselves. But let me again, when we talked about some of those highlights, when we talk about what was found in that little area, right, where Seti was, right, the grave of two men and two women who may have been members of his family were also located near the coffin. The discovery of the coffin at Tel Shadud is evidence of Egyptian control in Jezreel Valley in the late Bronze Age, 13th century BC, during the period when the pharaohs governed the country. Egyptian culture greatly influenced the local Canaanite upper class. Right? Signs of Egyptian influence are occasionally discovered in different regions of this time. Right? They were revealed at Tel Shadud. Right? That's important. The one that we found, and in the special tomb of the wealthy Canaanite. Right? Just talk about the ancient rare artifacts. What did it have? Right, the name of the crown of Pharaoh Seth the First, who ruled ancient Egypt. Right, that's very important in the 13th century BC. And remember, we talked about how his body was missing. Right, his body was missing from at first from his own tomb. His body was missing, but now they found it. They found his body. So very important to know. Very important to know. So obviously having on that seal, right, that we know that Seti, the one of the father of Ramses II, right? Just gonna skip a little down and let's get a little deep into this. So let me click something here. Talk about that. So that was just some things. So let me point something out here, which we were talking about, right? We would talk about that when we would talk about some of the things that happened, because right after these pharaohs, that's when later on, you'll hear that Israel was in the Levant, but not at this time. That's what's important. This is going to tell you the time when the pharaoh before the Exodus were ruling the area of the Levant, and his family going to be settled down in certain areas. You can see right here, the Canaanite cities continue to try to basically, push off the Egyptian rule, but obviously the Egyptians are powerful. An Egyptian, obviously, they found a stele, right? It was found in 1928, right? Just get a little bit going on there. This is the stele, or a little area. I'm just gonna go down just to talk about what's going on there. You can see right here, where it talks about what's going on, just talk about basically Egyptian military conquest is what we was talking about during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I, who basically calmed down a rebellion. This is the one we was talking about. At that time, basically they had several rebellions in that city, right? Attempted to take the area, but was crushed by the Egyptians. Long story short. In 2014, basically, obviously looking at some of the excavations, look what they found, right? A savage excavation unearthed a clay coffin dated to the 13th century. Inside was a gold ring bearing the name of the Egyptian pharaoh Seti I, son of Ramses II and father of Ramses, or son of Ramses I, father of Ramses II, right? Commonly identified as the pharaoh of the Exodus. So that's it's getting really important, because it's letting us know what's going on in these areas, because it's a tell, right? A tell is going to have multiple layers. There's a lot of things going on with these things when you see these tells. So talk about the coffin right here. Obviously talks about what's going on there, right? Probably the burial of a wealthy Canaanite, probably an official, right? Probably an official of the Egyptian army, right? See what's going on there? But the whole name of Seti I is there. And we know that was the area that he had to lock down, right? Just obviously talk about bearing what's inside of it. Inside the coffin was a gold ring bearing the name of the Egyptian pharaoh Seti I, son of Ramses I and father of Ramses II. You can see the ring, right? Someone know how to read that. They'll know what's going on there. So you can see what's going on there, right? Close that. All right, so let's keep on keeping on. So why is that important? Because Yah said something at that time. He said something. He said Exodus 8:23, and I will put a division between my people and your people, and tomorrow shall be this sign, right? So it's a difference between the people of Pharaoh and the people of God, right? Just to get a little understanding of these things, right? Let's dive a little more into it. The reason why it's important just for understanding haplogroups. What would be the father's line? That would be the line of Israel versus the line that would be of the strangers of a different group that wouldn't be Israel, right? Here's that coffin, Egyptian coffin, gold seal with king's name found in Israel. So you see what's going on there. Archaeologists find a Canaanite official burial in to the reign of Seti I, right? So it's letting you know what's going on there, right? They got a lot of things that's going on there when they're looking at these things on obviously knowing that this is something that is true, right? This is solid information, right? Inside whom lay a small golden scarab seal bearing the throne name of King Seti I of Egypt, one of the most powerful rulers of the Nile over 3,000 years ago. So that's gonna be very important to know that we're actually noting that this individual is gonna be there, right? So now this is what gets important about the way that they're buried and everything, right? Egyptians traditionally buried dead in Egyptian soil, and the grave goods were distinctly Canaanite. Four other bodies, likely members of the man's family, were found buried nearby in similar styles. Canaanites. It just talks about basically were not basically accustomed to burying themselves in coffins of this sort. So this is what makes it important too. Though it's found in the land of Canaan, it's buried in a certain style, right? The Canaanite style of burial is different. And the man on earth was laid to rest whole in an Egyptian style. That's important, right? Completeness of body and a basic thing in Egyptian burial. That's because they believe the soul of the dead is meant to leave the body after death and whatnot. Just saying that it looks more like an Egyptian burial style, right? That's what makes it very important, right? They're breaking it down and everything, talk about what's going on and everything. It's just the presence or very strong culture influence of Egypt in the land of Israel during the second millennium BC. So get more pinpoint to some things. Probably aim obviously the area of Jezreel, right? They shall hear of Jezreel, right? There's a tell, right? All right, so let's go. Let's keep on going. So obviously getting some understanding of what's going on there. Very, very important stuff to note. Very, very important stuff to note there. So just to show a little bit of their reconstructing it. So they're just showing the pieces, right? They're taking it, they're putting it together and everything. And they know that that's a certain style of Egyptian burial that they were doing at that time. That's how they were basically burying themselves, because they have a whole bunch of them that was buried like that. So that's very important to get a little understanding on there. Just to point out something else real fast. This one I'll leave alone. This is just some understanding of certain movements. I'll just leave that one alone for now. But this is what's important. So you would expect, if you try to look it up. You can find genetics on almost any pharaoh. You can find Ramses III. You can find Tutmosis. You can find a whole bunch of pharaohs. You can find all these pharaohs I showed you right here. But try to type down something like this. Try to type down, right? Seti or rampant, right? Haplogroup. And why is it that it becomes more complex to find it, right? So obviously Seti, you're gonna have some summaries on them and whatnot. Sometimes right on a lot of these things, they go right to where they talk about where they are and everything. You can see where we're gonna get some of the talks of these things. I'm just gonna go. See, this one don't have it. Right. If you try to look for the haplogroup, is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult. But this is what was found. Let me show you what was found as we keep on going deeper into it. All right, so let me just scroll down. All right, so very important. Let me actually go to it. I have it on the sheet. I gotta open it up. I'm gonna point out to the one we found in Tel Shadud of that one of the one that we found. Pretty much, I'm gonna show you when I grab it. Let me just open this note here, right here. All right. So this was one of those lists that just had a whole bunch of different studies on it. I like those ones because they're kind of random. They're not just like focused on one place, but they have a lot of important controversial finds. So this was a study where this is at, where this study is on, is from here. Talked about this study before. So it's just on the supplementary area. But this is what it is. There's just a study on multiple different things, actually. Ancient human genome-wide data from a 3,000-year-old, basically, areas of the Caucasus and whatnot, and different regions and connecting. But let me show you this real fast. Right here. All right. So before I get to this, let me make sure I point out again some highlights. Right, is at Tel Shadud. Right, that's where we see the connections of Seti. Or somewhere on this thing. So this is Seti, pretty much at the Jezreel Valley, pretty much. I'll grab one from one of these. Actually, I think I'm gonna open up one up this so that I can kind of break down what's going on there. Right here. This is where it's connecting that individual. So right here at Tel Shadud, or Tel Sharad, right here. You can see right here, right, talking about Seti. You can see when they're talking about him, just go down right here. Remember we was talking about that inside the coffin? Was that writing of Seti right there? In that certain time frame right there? That's going to be important. Also, let me just close some of these that we don't need. Right? Let's just talk about some of the letters that was going on there. And we don't need this one. Just gonna make sure what we need open is open. Right there. All right, I'm gonna open one more of these, as point this out at the same time is important with it. All right. So you can see what's going on there. I'm gonna put that one down there. Leave these open at the same time so we can get a look at these things. Let me make sure. All right. This one is all right too. Leave that there. Because all these things are important. Now, here's before I move forward, right? You would think that they can pull genetics from Ramses II because they have his hair, right? If you know someone tried to steal some hair from Ramses and they pretty much got the hair, right? Here's basically what happened. When they took the mummy of Ramses II in the 1980s, to prove that he was the Pharaoh of Moses, one of the researchers stole his hair on basically one of the restoration trips, right, in France, putting it in a safe in his house. When the restorer passed away, his son tried to sell the hair. So he was trying to sell the hair for like 2,000 something bucks, and they ended up finding out that that was the hair that was stolen from Ramses the second. So, and you've seen they can obviously get genetics from hair like they did from obviously Napoleon, right? Napoleon Bonaparte. They can take genetics from him. Obviously, they can get genetics from someone else, but this was interesting. They got his hair, so I thought the texture was interesting. It looks kind of orange, and it's kind of like more thin, like a thin texture. But you can see right here locks of 3,200-year-old hair from Ramses II were unrevealed at the obviously Egyptian Museum, whatnot. See what's going on there. It says it obviously was stolen 30 years ago, right, in France and everything, put up for sale on the internet. So very interesting. But now let me show you a genetic result from the person that they found in Tel Shadud, right? The person that they actually found here when they did the genetic result is something that this is why it's hard to find the genetics of Ramses family line, because it's controversial. But let me show you what it is. All right. Let me just grab it right here. All right, so here it is right here. All right, so this is going to be the one in Tel Shadud. It's going to be 11934. And what you can see there in Tel Shadud, you can actually note that it's going to have mtDNA I and yDNA J. That's going to be very important. And note the time frame there, between 14 to 11 BC. So 1,400 to 1,100 BC. That's about 3,200 years ago. And note that 3,200 years ago, isn't that about this same time frame, right? You can see this here, right here, right? About 3,200 years ago with his hair. All these things. You see what's going on there? And remember, this one also, Seti lived about that same time, right? Continuing while his son was there, right? He's gonna be ruling in a certain area. That's gonna be very important. He actually takes the area of the Levant. So that's what I just showed, that he takes these areas and he settles basically a rebellion. Right after he settles that rebellion, he ends up basically settling in these areas. Right, he's gonna be one of the kings that's there. And also his body was missing. Right, we talked about that earlier. That when they found his tomb, right, when they found Seti's tomb, right, his body was gone. Right, you can look it up. That Seti's body, when they found his original tomb, his body wasn't in his tomb. But you can look up now. Obviously, we have the mummy now, right? You can see, right? Seti, they say one of the most preserved ones, right? One of the most preserved mummies, right? You can't really see the hair there, whatnot. But we do got Ramses II's hair, right? So that's what Ramses II, and we kind of got an idea. He kind of got like a orangish hair, right? Like a hairstyle there, and he kind of got like a nose that you would kind of see in certain areas of the Caucasus. The reason why I say that's important is because this find right here is actually important. The reason why is because if you look at the mtDNA I5 and follow it, what you'll quickly find out is where that line actually goes. Where actually that line actually goes real fast. Let's go down and look at that. So here's a couple of examples of some movements of that line. So a couple of different aspects of the movements of that line. Check this out. So what we actually have here, if you can see here, this line actually has a I5, right? It's going to have an I5 here. And we can note, remember, this is going to be this line right here. You can see right here, found that area. That's going to be 1934, right? That's going to be the same one. 1934 right there. So obviously this site is going to be using actual finds, actual fossils. But notice here, this I5A, that mtDNA, that's going to be a female. And notice in the Hittite area. Why is that important? Because the Hittites and the Egyptians had ties. That's going to be very important that the Egyptians and the Hittites had ties. And this is going to be a long time ago, a fairly long time ago. So that's going to be very, very important. And then notice another movement here. Right here, almost about the area of Matani. Notice that I5 there with this J lineage. So this is going to be about that time of those pharaohs. So give or take about that time. So you can see right here, it's about 3,000 years ago, right? Middle late Bronze Age. So give or take about that time, right? Of that pharaoh, right? You can see that same mtDNA, but about the area of here, right? Where you see the Caucasus over here, about Armenia, right? J. And then you notice, and the reason why that's important, because this is not where Israelites, they don't come out from this way, right? But notice, look what you see right here. Here's another one all the way up there, right? And now what's interesting about this is that this one would be an R lineage, right? But it has an I, it's connected with that I lineage, I5, right? So it's going to have a connection in this area. So you can, and what you can note, right? If we look at this area, we can note that we have like a major group in this area that's kind of like mingling and mixing, right? That's going to be very important. I think there's another one. So right here, look at that J group, J, and note this J. This is what's important. This was really important. J-M304 is important to remember. Why? Because that's going to be your root of all your J's. So it's basically saying the root of all your J's start in the Caucasus. How do we know? Because what makes that is IJK. I mean IJ, obviously coming from IJK. But IJ makes your root J, which is J-M304. So that's your root J. That makes obviously your J1 and J2. So your J1, J2, and not. So you can see your J2 right here. All right. That's going to be your J2, and it's going to be your J1 right here. That's going to be where your P58 come from. So it's letting you know that the actual root of J, right, is actually is stationed at the Caucasus. That's important. And notice the mtDNA. There's the same mtDNAs. They kind of mixing and mingling together. And remember, this J came in later after the R lineage. So this makes sense. These certain lineages that are mixing with these same females in these areas of the Hittites and Mitanni in certain areas around the Caucasus and a little above the Caucasus, about this area, right? We're getting a major mixing in that area, right? And that's why we had touched on some of the things of those things. But also important to know, about 2000 BC, right? Second millennium, 2000 BC, Akkadian became one of the natural languages of that area. So sometimes, like I did a live where we talked about it, where we broke it down a little bit. Let me just kind of like show why I'm saying that, what I mean, right? There's a lot of nations that pick up Semitic, right? They may be speaking Semitic, but that doesn't mean that they're Shemitic, that they're Shemites. So a lot of people end up picking up the language, but they're not Shemitic, right? So sometimes you'll see things like that certain nations will pick up certain styles of linguistics, and yet they will speak another language. They can easily speak another language. That's that lingua franca, how you say that. But let me point out something real fast. On a note on Assyria and some of the Levantan areas, because it's important to know about the phases of empires. Like, for example, right? When we think of even just the Sumerians and stuff like that, it doesn't just go to one phase, it goes to multiple phases. Just like how we know that Abraham came from the third dynasty of which would not look like how a beginning Akkadian empire looked, but they would be more towards the far end where they start to develop at. They don't stretch all the way through. They just stable in one place, because certain places like Mari and Ebla, you got to know the story of how those places were invaded by northern countries. We also can find that in the genetics. The genetics also tells us that. Let's see, where is this? I'm just going to type it down. All right. All right. So let me show what I'm talking about. So, as an example of what I mean when I'm talking about some of the transition of the empires and stuff. So let me just go down real fast. So obviously, one of the major things to know about the Levant is what happens before the Sea People's invasion and what happens after the Sea People's invasion. So very important to know that the certain city that I'm talking about is a city that was one defeated, destroyed. Tel Shadud, it was destroyed, taken, and then all of a sudden it was built by the Egyptians and destroyed by the Sea Peoples. But that's something that's important to understand. But let me point something out. So obviously, this is what the Levant will look like at a certain time frame, right? You'll have certain areas ruled by the Akkadians, right? This is earlier than what we was pointing at. This is like 4,000, 5,000 years ago, long time ago. And obviously, you have your Hurrians up there. They're going to be mixing, and they actually attack some of these places and basically establish themselves in some of these areas. But let me first point something out here with the Akkadians, because when you think of the dynasty, these certain dynasties, we gotta know what happened. So remember, third dynasty of Here's something on the third dynasty of The third dynasty of arose the same time after the fall of the Akkadian dynasty. So the third dynasty of came after the Akkadian dynasty. So the Akkadians actually were fairly mixed, but the third dynasty of had more of the Shemitic lines there. That's important to go over. The period between the last powerful king of the Akkadian dynasty, and we'll just talk about some of these things, and the first king of right? They obviously say it's not well documented. They don't know the exact transition of it, but there is a change in the kingdom, pretty much, because there's a couple different changes, right? But we also got to note, right, the Akkadians' primacy. Instead, it says seem to have been basically, just to get it understood, is that you got a lot of nations like the Gutians and certain nations around that cause a lot of nations to fall. Sometimes they'll settle a nation, sometimes they won't, right? That's something I was talking about. And then also to know about the time of the first empire of the Babylonian Empire. Remember, they don't go on what's the word I'm looking for? Conquest to do genocide. But you can note genetics. We do know that the Shemitic E1B1B there. Here's a paper from a couple of famous right? A lot of sites is well known. Alika, right? A lot of these are Semitic places. They speak Semitic. That doesn't mean they're Shemites, but they do speak Semitic. There's some that will speak Semitic, right? It's gonna have certain names. I'll point out what's the names of these places real fast. Might as well show what the study is. I talked about this before. Right? It's by Cell. They did a study at basically Ebla and Alika and all these certain places, right? That do have linguistic connections, right? But they don't have what's the word I'm looking for? They don't have connections in genetics. So you can see some of the connections in these areas. I want to point out basically what they are, just to kind of make it clear what this is. So this is just a history of obviously the Caucasus. So genome history of the Neolithic to Bronze Age, Anatolia, Northern Levant, and Southern Caucasus. So giving us a little understanding of that. That's going to be from 2020. So it's just obviously fossil studies are always good no matter the year. It's going to give us fossil studies, right? Modern people. It's going to give us ancient people. So right here, it's just telling us what places, right? Tel Karad or Karad, how you say that? Ebla, right? It's going to give us Ebla, Alika, certain cities, because this area, if you look into the late Akkadian time frame, you'll notice that this area would fall or this area will be taken. It's an important transition that happens with this area of the Akkadians, right? Not the far area where you get Abraham emerging from Ur. It's gonna be a little separation. But let me show you what's going on this paper real fast. All right, so you can see right here, obviously, quickly, it's just to establish it. A lot of these places are the Akkadian places, but notice what we see here. Obviously, E1B1B. There's no doubt those are the Shemitic lineages, E1B1B. We can see the mtDNA, obviously, European mtDNA, U, because that's what happened in that area. They were giving their daughters to their daughters. They were mixing in that area, but this is going to be before the Israelites come out. These are going to be Shemites, probably like Eberites, Joktanites, right? Even Ishmaelites can be up there, right? Because they were there earlier. But this is going to be a line to note. It's going to be a very important line to note, just to get a little understanding on these things. So what else they got there? Well, they have some L lineages of males, J's, they got G's, right? A lot of that's lineages that's coming down. They got T's, right? H's, right? They got a lot of different types of lineages that come there. Obviously, CT. So high portion H, J, G, right? I talked about that H, J, G. These are early Japhetic lines, right? That would settle in certain areas. And note those mtDNAs. So it's gonna get a story there. What's going on there? So that's just important to know that a lot of those nations were highly mixed, right? These nations, you see how it's separated like that, right? That was their Akkadian areas, and then Ebla and Mari. These two different areas had different control. Different nations had took over these areas and were ruling over these areas, right? But remember, at this time frame, a lot of them spoke Semitic, right? A lot of these places did speak Semitic, but that doesn't mean they were originally Shemitic. So you can see, just like we was talking about, right? In the second millennium BC, Akkadian became basically a natural language for the whole area, the whole region. A lot of people spoke that language in that area. So it would be a suspected language. So Akkadian wouldn't be the best at finding like the ancient groups. You want to like go to more like ancient, older languages, but Akkadian is great in a way for finding certain groups. But if we wanted to start looking at certain groups, what's there, then we'll find a comprise of multiple mixes in that area. But origin is going to tell us where they come from and where they go. Now, let's also make something clear on this real fast. So obviously, the origin is in the Caucasus of J. We talked about that. Close this. All right, I'm gonna close some of these that we don't need, just to bring it all home to understanding here. So remember that this finding is important, because remember how we talk about the Mitanni, right? The king of the Mitanni was saying that he's a brother to a lot of the Egyptians. He was saying they were related and they were connected. They had ties together, right? So that's going to give us some important things that we need to understand, that there were some important ties. Also, how they have connections to the Minoans, different things like that, how they have connections to certain groups like that. And then obviously looking at that area of where we found in Tel Shadud, right? In Tel Shadud, that's where we found this said wealthy Canaanite, but he had a certain name, right? In his tomb, which was Seti the first. And remember, Seti was missing at first from his tomb. So that's very important. But they do know that Seti, right? They do know that Seti himself is now found, right? And this find here is right to his time with the same Egyptian style burials. Just like how we had talked about before, how the obviously the burials that were seen there in Tel Shadud and later sites indicate a strong link with New Kingdom Egypt. So you see what's going on there. So it's very, very important to note these things. So this is just kind of like a highlight of these things, just to kind of like put that down. So go back over here. So that's what we found when they found that coffin in Tel Shadud and the connection to Seti, right? So that finding was in Tel Shadud. And then obviously what was found in it was highly important, right? The name of that certain king and everything, Seti. And also noting that obviously J had signs as Egyptian pharaohs before that. So J had signs had as Egyptian pharaohs in the 18th dynasty. And then by the 19th dynasty, we have a clear sign of a J as in a relation to that pharaoh of the times of the Exodus. So this is going to be very important to know that this 11934, which we spoke about on this paper that we found when we was talking about that one that was found in Tel Shadud, right, with that mtDNA that links all the way to the Caucasus Mountain that we can follow by following the females that were settled over here by the area of the Hittites, and also how we can find a Y DNA of the same males, J, that was over here in the area of the Zagros Mountains, over here right next to the Hittites, over here where you will have nations that would be separate, not in the areas of Israel, not over here. And then obviously you have knowledge that this line was also mixing with R groups up there, this mtDNA, I5. And that group also shows that it mixed with the root J at that time in Russia. So right here in the Caucasus, you can see that J, the root J, J-M304, had that I5 over there mixing in the Caucasus. That's not where Israel was. That's not where Israel was developing, in the Caucasus. So you can see what's going on there. And also the fact of how in Tel Shadud, we found that connection to Seti, the one that settles in this little area here. So it's very important, this little battle. And then the movements of this little ruler here that basically takes the areas of the Levant and settle his family in certain areas to try to stop wars and whatnot and set a treaty, right? I don't know if I showed this. This
Peace
is
treaty. An unprecedented promise of alliance between Ramses and his mortal enemies, the Hittites.
So let's just talk about some of the treaties that they were making.
Warrior king and
right. So just to bring it home, that's what we was talking about. How if you want to understand what's the families that are going to be Israelites, you also should know what's the family that would be the family of the Egyptians, because that's also what we didn't talk about real fast, is that we know that exact lineage came in during the Bronze Age, right? That exact lineage came in during the Bronze Age, and that's going to be very important for keying down some of these things. That's why it makes sense that they later pick on Semitic languages, but we know A1 group, right, being in the area of Anatolia, it was centered around Kyrgyzstan, right? That's the area where it was mostly around, right? It was a center area for it. We know that it went to areas with the Scythians, right, stretching out throughout the north, ruling through areas of the north, right? We also know that it has high connections with Neanderthal, as we see right here. It also has connections with some of the K groups right here. And it says that these ones in the Caucasus Mountain had basically 1.7 to 2.4% of Neanderthal. They were Neanderthal in origin. So you can see what's going on there. And obviously getting a good understanding of these movements, and I talked about already of the changing of what was going on with the Sumerians, certain things that was happening over there, and invasions that came in from the north in that area. So here's just that one, the other study we was talking about on the basically a transition of the Amorites and Kassites and stuff like that that came in and became some of the Neo Assyrians, which technically the Neo Assyrians, New Assyrians, is a change of the original Assyrians to a new peoples, right? I'm just going to show the full picture here. So always remember that, yes, there actually is evidence that J became some Shemitic. They spoke Shemitic languages, but many other haplogroups spoke Shemitic languages. But the root of J is not in the lands where Shem was growing, where we know, like Josephus talks about in Damascus, that's where the Shemites were developing. They wasn't in the Levant for a long time, right? They was not in the Levant for a very long time, not till the Bronze Age. So that's very important to know, because we know that Shemites were there in the Levant before the Bronze Age, a long time. We know there was a long time there. But here's the roots of J. J starts here, right? Starts in the Caucasus. I showed this before. That's like your oldest J right there. And then from there, it goes up to Finland. So here, you can see it's in the areas of Finland. They'll say like 6,000, 5,000, and then it's there for another long time. And then from there, it goes downwards. So then it starts invading some of these places over here. So that's very important. It's going to start invading some of those places down in some of these areas, right? And some other areas nearby. You can see right here. So obviously having connections in this area over here, because they already went up here, they're going here, they're settling here, and they're splitting. Because from here, this is where it starts up here. They diversify and they start spreading here. They spread out. That's the line of Japheth, pretty much. Long story short, that's the one that's up there in the north, and also became some of the Egyptians, and mainly the Egyptian pharaoh that's linked to Seti. That's what's very important about this. So just to give a full picture, because there's also other Canaanite areas where we know that Canaanites were at fairly early, having connections to this very specific line. So that's why I talked about they came from these areas downwards into these areas, not from Egypt. They come out of Egypt. We can go into it more deep and talk about how that J group has connections with some of the pigs that were moving around from Greece, Anatolia, coming downwards. We talked about that before, that the culture also has those pigs in that culture and whatnot, just to, kind of get an understanding of also the culture's habits, right? Not just saying that, it was just the burials, but it was more than just the burials. It was pretty much the whole connection of the groups, pretty much, just to make it a long story short, to put it into understanding, to perspective. So that's pretty much what I wanted to show today. Other than that, if you have any questions, let me know. But I'll just do one more time, just a flash summary of what I was talking about. So we know that Ramses obviously had control of this area of the pretty much of the Levant.
The Hittites.
And they were going at it with the Hittites. Is a lot of records on the Battle of Kadesh about how they were fighting, and they settled here.
The Hittites at the fortress city of Kadesh, in possibly the largest chariot battle in history.
So is a very important battle that happens, and then all of a sudden, there's evidence of Canaanite, or in a sense, a new Canaanite occupation that's happening in this area. That's going to be fairly important. Let me see if I can just point something out here.
Destroying the city and occupying the entire area for centuries to come.
So that's important.
Long situated near to Canaan.
This part is actually important. I hope I showed this already.
This foe was Imperial Egypt.
So I don't know if I showed this already, but this little video talks about how Egypt came into Canaan. That's very important, right? So to know that they're the ones that pushed a lot of people out and settled in the
Dire items found at this 12th century BC of their vast empire. And finally, in the Bible, the account of the sack of the city by the Israelite leader Joshua.
So that's also important too. Obviously, having connections to the biblical narrative. That's why it was talked about, and some of the things that was settled in that area important. But also important to know about in 2000 BC, to claim someone just by linguistics is a genetic group just wouldn't really be that fair if we just look at it small. We got to look at the whole picture that, we can find E1B1B there. We can find R groups there. We can find J groups there. But rooting origin, we know that E1B1B roots to the Levant because we got some very old Natufian finds that are in the Levant, even some that said about 40,000 years ago, right? When putting on the out Africa scale, right? Obviously, I don't believe the out Africa scale, but that's on the scientific method. Now, we also know that J doesn't root to the Levant because, like we said, there's multiple papers that knows that J wasn't a lineage of the Levant. It was a lineage that was Levant later. It was a lineage that came in not in the Neolithic, but after the Neolithic. So very, very important. Let me actually point it out so that someone doesn't say we just saying stuff just for the sake of understanding, because it's all about facts, not about opinions and stuff. Because truth is true. Right here, we can even see it right here. Neolithic time frame. We get H. We get right here. We get T. So this color is T, and we also get an H group. So we get H with the blue, which is E, with the C group. So C and E was in the early Natufian. Then you get the transition to the Neolithic, and then all of a sudden, after the Neolithic, you get the Bronze Age. About the Bronze Age, you get a bunch of J's come in. So why in the Bronze Age you get a bunch of J's? Because Egypt ruled that area. Egypt ruled that area and started to settle his families into that area. So J's are into his area. Also, what's interesting too is remember J is just one portion of XVIIth. We also get other invasions that come in through that area. Mitanni comes down into that area at that time, right? Some of the sea peoples come down into that area at that time, and they have the same haplogroups. So a lot of these groups had the same haplogroups that come in a little later. That's why later on you'll see how mixed that area is later on. But at first it was all one way. And you can see even a paper that just says it directly, right? We can see right here. Here's a paper from basically this that basically talks about that situation. Just talks about continuity and admixture in the last 5 millennium of Levant history from ancient Canaanite and present day Lebanese genome samples. And you can see right here what we found. You can see right here, it says, looking at that study, that haplogroup J was absent in all Natufian and Neolithic. Every Levantan male that's Neolithic, no J was found in that time. So that haplogroup J was absent in all Natufian and Neolithic of Levant male individuals examined thus far. Because what's important is you're not just looking at a family just of Abraham. You're looking at his relatives, right? And we know that a lot of his relatives will be Levantan, ancient Levantan, right? Obviously, get into like el-Balah and the Joktanites and stuff like that, right? el-Balah, obviously Eber and different ones like that, Joktanites. So they should be in the Levant. They should have ancient presence in the Levant, but they don't. J doesn't have ancient presence in the Levant because we know who came to the Levant first. Remember I talked about that H and T, right? We can see a little study there. Here is in the Levant. You can see E1B1B, M34. That was a lot in the Levant. You got your H and there's a T there. but I'll just show you what they read right here. So according to a study right here, it says tested the first ancient DNA, just talk about from the Mesolithic Natufian culture in Israel, possibly the world's oldest, basically stationary culture, and found that the male individuals belong either to haplogroup CT or E1B1, right? These are today, it says older E1B1B samples, and it says they were accompanied by, right, the same haplogroups show up in pre-pottery Neolithic B, right, Neolithic time, accompanied by new haplogroups H2 and T. So that's why you get an H2 and T in that culture. So that's important to know that H2 and T enter into the Levant actually earlier than J. So that's very important that H2, right, and some T groups entered into the Levant earlier than J groups. They actually entered into that area earlier than J. That's important. So obviously, just to try to conclude that E is Hamites or Canaanites because they're in the Levant is undermining that there's other lineages in the Levant at that time, like T. T is in the Levant in the Neolithic time frame. H is in the Levant in the Neolithic time frame, but J is not in the Levant at the Neolithic time frame. It ends up popping up later on. And don't let this find that they say by Jordan confuse you, because one, they should have been in the areas of Africa. Rather, you should, if they was Israelites, they should have been in the areas of Africa rather than up in the north. That's what's very important. Why all of a sudden they pop up in the Levant later on? Because that's when you're starting to see a certain family line that rules in that area and certain sea people that come in at that time. So it's like a major invasion, right? Most likely planned out by the Most High, that this invasion happened at the same exact time and formed the area with the same haplogroup, right? Because that area was controlled by the Egyptians. So that's very important. So one haplogroup filled that whole area later on. But also it's important that the Israelites don't progress in the Bronze Age. They progress in the Iron Age. That's when the Israelites increase in the Levant, in the Iron Age. That's what's important. It's very undermined if we don't look at that the large portion of Israelite time frame would actually point us to the Iron Age, which we can find multiple different pieces of evidence that give us some understanding on those things. But with that understood, that's important to understand that that's why that Canaanite controlled area that was controlled by the what's the word I'm looking for? The Egyptians. It's important to know that that area that was controlled by the Egyptians was controlled during the time of Ramses the first to Seti the first to Ramses the second. So you can see what's going on there. So obviously, letting you know that that body was going. We talked about that. Talked about the connections, what it's connected with. Talked about the area, right? And make sure I see if we talked about this one, right? We obviously talked about that in connection to the Egyptian army, right? That's actually the one, right? That's actually the one we wanted to see because it's going to reveal that truth. And this one we talked about how obviously Canaan is controlled by obviously the the Egyptians, right?
At the famous Battle of Kadesh in 1289,
and they just talk about their little areas where they settle and whatnot here.
Settlements there, away from the eyes of their Egyptian overlords. Archaeological evidence later in 1170s, and it's the first time
all types of different involvements with it and everything. And then we talked about this right here. This is just that battle. I'm just let that one stand right there. And then this one we talked about. So we had talked about some of the highlights of basically the conquest of the Egyptians, how some of the Egyptians have built some of these little cities and whatnot in some of these areas, right? And then increasing. And this one is another little video that I'm pretty sure I would just talk about some, ancient Egypt highlights and everything. that's important to know about this family and how they end up ruling the Levant, right? Right. We're not talking about a time where they say, "Well, I took over now. Send me a Twitter message." Rather, they're ruling by total power, right? They're ruling by total power. So we found that Seti's body was missing, right? And they found his body. They found his body. So it's very important. Obviously, in the area where he was ruling at and controlling, getting a good understanding on some of these things. So with that, that's all I got for now. I'll make sure I showed everything what I wanted to show. Something else. Make sure. Yeah, this is just talk about some of the areas of his control.
Assyrian rulers to control the population.
Later on, obviously, later empires came over and took his the kingdom. So I'll go over this a little more deep another time, but I just want to let you know this because I never seen this brought out yet. But this is why that J is there. That J is from Seti the first, father of Ramses family, and that's what we found, right? And the exact time frame when we talk about Wells and where they had connections at, right? When they was talking about who was connected with whom and whatnot. Let me put that. Or scroll. I'll just scroll on this. So here's just this one was just talking about the language, what they were speaking, and they talk about who was all talking to each other, right? The writings of the 14th century, they consist of all these nations, right? Babylonians, Assyrians, Hittites, Mitanni, and everything. Right? They root to each other, but they were writing in Akkadian. So that's important to understand that language was basically like lingua franca in that time. So it was a language that everyone was speaking. And remember, this is going to be obviously the new kingdom dynasty. So very important to know that's why those Egyptian burial sites, right? Those Egyptian burial sites had ties to this exact time frame. So just to get a little understanding there. So, and it'll talk about certain kings that were in certain areas and whatnot. So ties to certain individuals. So that's that one we found. That's the one right there. So that's the find. And Tel Shadud is going to be a J line. Actually, pinpoint J-M267, which was J1, and has an mcDNA of I5, and even following that route of those lines, they're around this area. That's where they're from, right? Having family ties around this area. So we see even the root J, which makes your JP57, which is older than that one. That one has that I5 and is over there above the Caucasus. So that's very important. That lets us know where did that J come from and what is Seti's Seti connection really tied to. So with that, family, I guess that's it. That's all I got for you. With that, be blessed, be beloved, and